My husband's dying wish was for me to read his journal. I wish I had burned it instead. My husband died 6 weeks ago. Pancreatic cancer. Diagnosed in March, gone by September. We had been married for 14 years, and I thought I knew everything about him. I was wrong. Before he passed, he made me promise something. He told me there was a leather journal in his desk drawer and he wanted me to read it after he was gone. He said it would explain things. He said he couldn't leave without me knowing the truth. I asked him what truth, and he just squeezed my hand and said he was sorry. He died 2 days later. I waited 3 weeks before I could bring myself to open the drawer. The journal was brown leather, worn at the edges. I opened the first page and saw his handwriting and almost closed it right there. But I promised him. The first entries were normal. Our wedding day, buying our first house. How much he loved me. Then I got to an entry dated 8 years ago. It was about my best friend, Nadia. He wrote that he had started feeling things for her. He knew it was wrong. He hated himself for it. Every time she came over for dinner, he couldn't stop thinking about her. He looked forward to her visits more than anything else in his life. I felt sick reading it. I wanted to stop, but I couldn't. The entries continued. He wrote about a night when I was visiting my mother. Nadia came over to drop off a book. They talked for hours. She kissed him first. He didn't stop her. They slept together that night, and it was the best and worst moment of his life. I dropped the journal and threw up. When I came back, I kept reading because I had to know how deep this went. The affair lasted 2 years. Hotels, her apartment when her husband traveled, once in the back of his car. He wrote about the guilt every time he came home to me. He tried to end it multiple times but couldn't. He loved us both, he said, but in different ways. Nadia eventually ended it because she couldn't handle the guilt anymore. The entries after that were about being a better husband. He recommitted to our marriage. We took a vacation to Italy, and he wrote about how happy he was. He finally felt like he deserved me again. Then an entry from 3 years ago. Nadia's husband died in a car accident. He went to the funeral and held her while she cried. All the old feelings came back. He almost told her he still loved her but stopped himself. He chose me, he wrote. He kept choosing me every single day after that. The last entry was 2 weeks before he died. It was addressed to me. He was sorry for everything. He wanted me to know the truth because I deserved it. He hoped I could forgive him someday. He wrote that I was the love of his life, even if his actions didn't show it. I sat with that journal for 3 days without eating or sleeping. Then I called Nadia. When she walked through my door, she hugged me and told me she missed him too. I pulled back and asked if there was anything she wanted to tell me about her and my husband. Her face went pale. I told her I found his journal. She started crying and said she was sorry. She said it was the biggest mistake of her life. She ended it because she couldn't stand lying to me. I asked why she still came to our dinners and parties for years after. She said she didn't know how to stay away. Watching him with me was torture, but being away from both of us was worse. I asked if she loved him. She said yes. I asked if she still loved him when he died. She couldn't answer. I told her to leave. She begged me to let her explain. I told her she had been my best friend for 20 years, and she let me grieve next to her at my husband's funeral knowing what she did. That was unforgivable. She left crying. I haven't spoken to her since. Now I'm sitting here with this journal that was supposed to bring closure, and all I feel is hollow. My husband is dead. My best friend is gone. I'm supposed to live with this truth he gave me like some kind of gift. I keep thinking about what my life would have been like if I never opened that drawer. The 14 years I spent with a man I didn't really know. Whether any of it was real. The worst part is I still miss him. I still reach for him in bed. I still expect to hear his voice when I come home. I hate him for what he did, but I can't stop loving him, and I don't know which feeling is worse. All I know is that my husband's dying wish was for me to read that journal, and I wish with everything in me that I had just let it stay in that drawer. I spent the next 7 days inside the house reading that journal until the words blurred together. Every entry about her became something I could recite from memory. The way he described her laugh, how she touched his arm when she talked. The hotel on 5th Street where they went on Thursdays. I read until my eyes burned and my head pounded and I still couldn't stop. On the 4th day, the garbage disposal started making a grinding noise and then stopped working completely. I stared at the switch for 20 minutes trying to remember if he ever mentioned who fixed things like that. We had a file somewhere with repair people's numbers, but he always handled it. I opened 3 different drawers in the kitchen before giving up and leaving the broken disposal alone. The sink filled with dirty dishes because I couldn't bring myself to care about any of it. My phone rang Tuesday afternoon while I was on the couch with the journal open to the entry about their first time. My mother's name lit up the screen. I watched it ring through to voicemail. She called back an hour later. Then again the next morning. On the 3rd call, I finally answered because I knew she'd just show up at the house if I didn't. She asked how I was doing, and I said fine. My voice sounded flat even to my own ears. She asked if I was eating, and I lied and said yes. She asked if I needed her to come over, and I said no too quickly. There was a long pause where I could hear her breathing on the other end. She knew something was wrong. Mothers always know. But how could I explain that my husband's final gift to me was the complete destruction of everything I thought my life had been? How could I tell her that the man she watched me marry and helped me care for while he died had been sleeping with my best friend for 2 years? I made some excuse about being tired and she let me go, but I could hear the worry in her voice when she said she loved me. Thursday morning, a number I didn't recognize called and left a voicemail. I almost deleted it without listening, but something made me press play. A man's voice said his name was Sterling Powell and he was the lawyer handling my husband's estate. He said there were documents that needed my signature and asked me to call back to schedule an appointment. I sat there holding the phone and realized I'd been ignoring every piece of mail that came to the house for weeks. Bills were probably piling up. Insurance forms needed filing. The whole practical side of death that doesn't stop just because you're drowning. I called Sterling back and his assistant scheduled me for the following Tuesday. Forcing myself to engage with reality felt like dragging weights. That afternoon, I walked into our bedroom without thinking and ended up in the closet. His clothes still hung there exactly where he left them. I reached out and touched a blue shirt he wore all the time. Then I pressed my face into it and breathed in. His cologne was still there in the fabric. That specific scent that meant him. For just a second, I forgot about the journal and felt the comfort of missing him the normal way. Then I remembered what he did, and the comfort turned into something ugly in my chest. I wanted to rip every shirt off the hangers and throw them in the yard and light them on fire. But I also wanted to crawl into the closet and wrap myself in his smell and pretend none of it was real. I stood there for maybe an hour holding that shirt and hating that it still made me feel safe. My phone buzzed with a text from Nadia. Then another one. Then a missed call. I deleted the voicemail notification without listening. Another text came through asking me to please just talk to her. My finger moved to the block button and hovered there. It would be so easy to just press it and make her disappear from my phone the way she'd disappeared from my life. But I couldn't do it. Some weak part of me couldn't cut that final thread, and I hated myself for it. I shoved the phone under a couch cushion so I wouldn't have to see her name pop up again. Friday evening, someone knocked on the front door. I thought about not answering, but then remembered Gracelyn Marshall from next door had been watching me through her kitchen window for the past week. She'd probably noticed I hadn't taken the trash out or gotten the mail or done anything that required going outside. I opened the door, and she stood there holding a casserole dish. She said she made too much and thought I might want some. We both knew that was a lie. She said she hadn't seen me outside in a while and just wanted to check in. Her voice was gentle but not pitying. I thanked her and reached for the dish. She handed it over and said if I needed anything I should just knock. Then she left without pushing for more. Her concern registered somewhere in my brain even though I felt too numb to really appreciate it. I put the casserole in the fridge and went back to the couch. Saturday, I forced myself to go to the grocery store because the fridge was empty except for Gracelyn's casserole. I made it through produce and halfway down the cereal aisle before I saw Rebecca Brooks from book club. She and her husband used to come to our dinner parties. She rushed over and hugged me and said she'd been meaning to call. She asked how I was holding up. The question was so normal. So standard for someone whose husband died. But my internal chaos was so far from normal that something broke loose in my throat and I started laughing. Not funny laughing. The kind that sounds wrong. Rebecca's face went confused and concerned. I mumbled something about needing to go and walked away from my half-full cart. I left it sitting there in the middle of the aisle and went straight to my car. That night, I couldn't sleep. At 2 a.m, I got up and pulled out the photo albums from the hall closet. I spread them across the living room floor and started going through every picture. Our wedding, holidays, parties where Nadia was there smiling next to us. I studied her face in each photo looking for signs of guilt, looking for the woman who was sleeping with my husband while she stood next to me wearing a stupid party hat. I looked at his face too, searching for longing or regret or anything that would have told me the truth if I'd just been paying attention. Every picture looked different now, like those optical illusions where once you see the hidden image you can't unsee it. I went through 5 albums before the sun came up. Tuesday morning, I put on real clothes for the first time in over a week and drove to Sterling Powell's office downtown. The waiting room had leather chairs and magazines nobody ever reads. A receptionist led me back to his office and he stood up to shake my hand. He was maybe 50 with gray at his temples and the kind of calm voice lawyers probably practice. He said he was sorry for my loss and then got down to business. He explained that I was the beneficiary on my husband's life insurance policy. Then he mentioned there was also a savings account I might not know about. My stomach dropped. He said it had $18,000 in it. I asked when my husband opened it and Sterling checked his notes and said 8 years ago. Right when the affair started. The timing hit me like a fist. I asked Sterling what the account was for. He looked at his papers and said there was no specific designation. Just regular monthly deposits that went in for about 5 years. Then they stopped. I did the math in my head. 5 years of deposits. The affair lasted 2 years. Then 3 years of deposits after Nadia ended it. Then nothing. The deposit stopped 3 years ago, which was exactly when Nadia's husband died, and my husband wrote about almost telling her he still loved her. I sat in that leather chair in Sterling's office and wondered if my husband had been saving money to leave me. If the whole time he was writing about choosing me, he'd been keeping an escape fund ready just in case. I thanked Sterling and left his office feeling sick. The drive home took 20 minutes, but I don't remember any of it. I kept thinking about those monthly deposits, how they started exactly when he first wrote about wanting her, how they continued through the affair and then stopped right when her husband died. The timing was too perfect to be random. When I got home, I went straight to his desk and started pulling out drawers. I needed to find something that would explain the money, prove it wasn't what I thought it was. Bank statements, receipts, anything that showed he meant to use that money for us instead of an escape plan with her. The papers were a mess because I'd never organized them after he died. Bills mixed with insurance forms mixed with random notes he'd written to himself. I found a folder marked taxes and flipped through it, but there was nothing about the savings account. Then I found another folder at the back of the bottom drawer. Inside were printed emails between him and a real estate agent from 5 years ago. The subject line said inquiry about downtown condos. My hands started shaking as I read through them. He'd asked about one-bedroom apartments, places with parking, buildings that allowed pets even though we didn't have any. The agent had sent him listings and he'd responded asking about lease terms and whether the building had good security. The last email was him saying he needed more time to think about it. I sat on the floor with those emails spread around me and tried to make sense of it. 5 years ago was right in the middle of the affair. He was looking at apartments, one-bedrooms, places for one person, or maybe two if you were starting over. The savings account had enough for a security deposit and first few months' rent. I wanted to throw up again, but nothing came out. 3 days later, I was still moving through the house like a ghost. I'd stopped answering my phone completely. The mail piled up by the door because I couldn't make myself care about bills or sympathy cards or whatever else people were sending. I ate crackers standing at the counter because sitting at the table meant looking at his empty chair. The doorbell rang Wednesday afternoon and I ignored it. Then it rang again. Then someone knocked. Not gentle like before, but firm and steady like they weren't leaving. I looked through the peephole and saw Gracelyn holding a container. I almost didn't open it, but she knocked again and something about the sound made me turn the lock. She smiled when the door opened and held up the container. She said she'd made soup and thought I might want some. I started to thank her and reach for it like last time, but she didn't hand it over. Instead, she asked if she could come in for a minute. I hesitated and she took that as a yes, walking past me into the hallway. She went straight to the kitchen and I followed because I didn't know what else to do. She set the soup on the counter and looked around. The sink was full of dishes I hadn't washed in over a week. Empty mugs covered the counter next to cereal boxes I'd left open. She didn't say anything about the mess, just rolled up her sleeves and started filling the sink with hot water. I told her she didn't need to do that, but she waved me off and squirted dish soap into the water. She asked where I kept the sponges and I pointed to the cabinet under the sink. She pulled one out and started scrubbing a plate while I stood there feeling useless and embarrassed. She talked while she worked, her voice casual like we were having a normal conversation. She said she'd been divorced 10 years ago and it was the worst time of her life. She found out her husband was having an affair when she checked their credit card statement and saw charges from hotels she'd never been to. I leaned against the counter and watched her hands move through the soapy water. She said she confronted him and he admitted everything. Said he'd been seeing someone from his office for almost a year. They tried counseling, but it didn't work because he didn't really want to stop seeing the other woman. She rinsed the plate and set it in the drying rack. Her voice stayed matter-of-fact, like she was talking about something that happened to someone else. She said the worst part wasn't the affair itself, but realizing she'd been living with a stranger who could lie to her face every single day. Something in my chest cracked when she said that. I tried to hold it in but couldn't. Tears started coming, and once they started, I couldn't stop them. I slid down the cabinet to the floor and cried for the first time since reading that journal. Gracelyn dried her hands and sat down next to me. She didn't try to hug me or tell me it would be okay. She just sat there while I cried, and when I finally caught my breath, she handed me a dish towel to wipe my face. I told her everything. About the journal and Nadia and the affair that lasted 2 years. About finding out my husband and my best friend had been together while I was visiting my mother, while I was at work, while I was planning dinners where they both sat at my table pretending everything was normal. I told her about confronting Nadia and kicking her out and not speaking to her since. I told her about the savings account and the emails about apartments, and how I was pretty sure my husband had been planning to leave me. Gracelyn listened and kept washing dishes like it helped her process what I was saying. She didn't interrupt or ask questions. When I finished talking, she was drying the last plate. She put it away in the cabinet above the stove, which was completely wrong because plates go in the cabinet next to the sink. But I didn't correct her. She put away 3 more dishes in wrong places before she turned around and looked at me. She said she was sorry I was going through this. Then she said she'd come back tomorrow if that was okay. I nodded because I didn't trust my voice. She gave me a quick hug and let herself out. After she left, I sat in my clean kitchen and felt slightly less alone than I had in weeks. That night, I actually slept. Not the half-awake dozing I'd been doing where every noise made me think he was still alive, but real sleep that lasted 6 hours straight. When I woke up Thursday morning, the sun was coming through the bedroom window, and for about 10 seconds, I felt almost normal. Then I remembered everything and the weight came crashing back. But it was different somehow. Lighter maybe, or just more manageable. I could breathe without my chest feeling crushed. I got out of bed and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table looking at the dishes Gracelyn had put away wrong. The small relief of having slept made me feel guilty immediately. Like I didn't deserve to feel even slightly better after what I'd learned. My husband was dead and had betrayed me, and I'd lost my best friend, and here I was feeling grateful for 6 hours of sleep. The guilt made my stomach hurt, but I drank the coffee anyway. My mother showed up Friday morning without calling first. I heard her car in the driveway and looked out the window to see her getting out with her purse and a grocery bag. She had a key from when my husband was sick and she'd come over to help, so she let herself in and called my name. I met her in the hallway and she took one look at me and frowned. She said I looked terrible and had she been eating. I told her I was fine and she said that was obviously a lie. She went to the kitchen and started unpacking the grocery bag, bread and eggs and fruit and other things she thought I needed. She asked why I'd been avoiding her calls and I said I'd just been dealing with stuff. She turned around and crossed her arms and said she was my mother, and she knew when something was wrong beyond normal grief. I sat down at the table and she sat across from me. I told her about the journal. I watched her face as I explained what my husband had written, about the affair with Nadia and how long it lasted and how he wanted me to know the truth. Her expression went from confused to shocked to angry, so fast I could barely track it. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and stared at the table. Finally, she said she was going to say something terrible about my dead husband, and she was sorry, but she couldn't help it. Then she called him a selfish bastard for dumping this on me when he was dying and couldn't face the consequences. The anger in her voice matched what I'd been feeling, and somehow that made me feel less crazy. She reached across the table and grabbed my hand. Her eyes were wet and sad, and she looked older than I remembered. She said she was so sorry I was dealing with this alone. I told her she didn't need to apologize for being honest. She asked if I wanted her to stay, and I said yes. She made me eggs even though it was afternoon, and I ate them because she was watching. After she left, I felt less alone than I had since reading the journal. Andres called again the next week and asked if I wanted to get coffee. I said yes because sitting in the house was making me crazy. We met at a place downtown where my husband and I never went. Andres ordered black coffee and I got tea because coffee made my stomach hurt lately. He asked how I was doing and I gave him the standard answer about taking it day by day. He nodded like he understood even though he couldn't possibly. We talked about work stuff and the weather and other safe topics until I couldn't stand it anymore. I asked him if my husband ever mentioned Nadia when they worked together. Andres looked down at his coffee cup and I watched his face carefully. He took a long time to answer. Finally, he said yes. My husband talked about both of us like we were the most important people in his world. He said my husband would mention Nadia coming to dinner or helping me with something, and he'd light up talking about how great our friendship was. Andres said he thought it was nice that I had such a close friend, and my husband was grateful for that. The information sat heavy in my chest. My husband talked about us both to his coworkers like we were these wonderful parts of his life, and the whole time he was sleeping with her. I thanked Andres for being honest and changed the subject. We finished our drinks and he walked me to my car. Before I got in, he said my husband really did love me. That was obvious to everyone who knew him. I nodded and drove home feeling worse than before. 3 days later, a letter arrived with Nadia's sister's name on the return address. I almost threw it away without opening it, but curiosity won. Inside was 2 pages of neat handwriting from Aurelie Devine. She said she was sorry for what her sister did to me. She said she didn't know about the affair until recently when Nadia broke down and told her everything after our confrontation. Aurelie wrote that she understood if I never wanted to speak to any of them again, but she wanted me to know she was thinking of me. At the bottom, she included her phone number and said I could call if I ever needed to talk. I put the letter on the kitchen counter and stared at it for 2 days. I kept picking up my phone and putting it down. Finally, on Saturday morning, I called before I could change my mind. Aurelie answered on the second ring and sounded surprised to hear from me. I asked if she meant what she wrote about talking, and she said yes, absolutely. We agreed to meet that afternoon at a coffee shop across town where no one would know either of us. Aurelie was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table looking nervous. She stood up when she saw me, and I could see the family resemblance to Nadia in her face, which made my stomach clench. We sat down, and she immediately started apologizing. I told her she didn't need to apologize for her sister's actions. She twisted her napkin in her hands and said Nadia had been devastated since our confrontation. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded. Aurelie ordered coffee, and I got water because my hands were shaking, and I didn't trust myself with a hot drink. She told me Nadia loved him genuinely, that it wasn't just physical. She said Nadia had been in therapy trying to understand why she betrayed her best friend. This information didn't make me feel better, but it added another layer of complexity I had to carry. I asked Aurelie how she could know it was real love and not just guilt talking. Aurelie said Nadia kept a journal too during those years, and she'd seen some of it. She said her sister wrote about him constantly, about how wrong it was, but how she couldn't stop. The idea of Nadia writing about my husband the same way he wrote about her made me feel sick. I asked Aurelie if Nadia ever planned to tell me the truth. Aurelie looked down at her coffee and shook her head. She said no. Nadia convinced herself she was protecting me by staying silent. She thought telling me would only hurt me and wouldn't fix anything since the affair was already over. The twisted logic of this made me laugh bitterly into my water glass. Aurelie flinched at the sound. I told her that Nadia got to move on with her life while I lived a lie, thinking my marriage and friendship were real. Aurelie said she knew it wasn't fair and she was sorry. We sat in silence for a minute before I asked if Nadia had always been like this, making selfish choices and calling them protective. Aurelie's face went red and she said no, that Nadia was usually the most loyal person she knew, which was why this whole thing didn't make sense to anyone who knew her. I finished my water and stood up to leave. Aurelie asked if we could talk again sometime, and I said maybe. I left her sitting there with her coffee and drove home feeling hollower than before. The insurance agent called Monday morning about a complication with the life insurance payout. My heart started racing immediately because I thought maybe my husband had done something else I didn't know about. The agent said there was a secondary beneficiary listed for a small portion that I wasn't aware of. I asked who it was and held my breath thinking it might be Nadia. The agent said it was a cancer research charity. The relief hit me so hard I had to sit down. The agent kept talking about paperwork I needed to sign, but I barely heard him. My husband had designated money for cancer research while he was dying of cancer. This small kindness from him made something crack open in my chest. I drove to the insurance office that afternoon to sign the papers. The agent was middle-aged with kind eyes, and he explained everything twice to make sure I understood. When he got to the part about the cancer research donation, I started crying right there in his office. He looked uncomfortable and pushed a box of tissues across the desk toward me. I tried to stop but couldn't. Here was proof that my husband was capable of thoughtful, generous acts even at the end of his life. The same man who betrayed me for 2 years was also the man who wanted his death to help find a cure. I didn't know how to hold both truths in my head at the same time. The agent waited quietly while I cried, and then gently walked me through the rest of the paperwork. When I left his office, I sat in my car for 20 minutes trying to reconcile the man who did this with the man who betrayed me. I couldn't do it. They felt like two different people living in the same body. Gracelyn knocked on my door Wednesday evening and asked if I wanted to come to her book club. I started to say no, but she said it would be good for me to get out and be around other people. The idea of sitting home alone with my thoughts was worse than the idea of book club, so I said yes. We walked to her friend's house 2 streets over. There were 6 women sitting in a living room with wine and cheese. They all knew my husband had died, but not about the affair. Their careful sympathy felt both suffocating and necessary. They asked how I was doing, and I gave vague answers. We talked about the book, which I hadn't read. One woman did most of the talking while the rest of us listened and nodded. Halfway through the discussion, one of the women mentioned her husband's emotional affair years ago and how they worked through it. This opened a flood of stories from the other women. One talked about her ex cheating with a coworker. Another mentioned her husband's drinking problem and the lies that came with it. Everyone had stories of betrayal and forgiveness and working through hard things. They shared advice about therapy and communication and rebuilding trust. I sat silent on the couch holding my wine glass. My situation had no possibility of working through anything. My husband was dead and couldn't apologize again or make amends or go to therapy. The finality of it pressed down on me while these women talked about second chances. Gracelyn noticed my silence and squeezed my hand. After book club ended and everyone left, I told Gracelyn I couldn't do group things where people expected me to be healing in normal ways. She nodded and said she understood. Then she suggested individual therapy instead, and gave me the name of a grief counselor who specialized in complicated losses. The woman's name was Veronica Ricci. Gracelyn said she'd helped her sister after a difficult loss. I took the number and put it in my pocket, knowing I probably wouldn't call, but grateful to have the option. I called Veronica Ricci on Thursday morning. The receptionist was friendly and asked what brought me in. I said grief counseling, and she scheduled me for the following week. She emailed an intake form that asked standard questions about my loss. I wrote husband in the box asking who died. Then there was a section asking me to describe my situation, and I stared at the blank space for 10 minutes. How could I summarize finding out my dead husband had a 2-year affair with my best friend? I wrote that I was struggling with complicated feelings about my husband's death and left it at that. The form felt inadequate, but I didn't know what else to say. Veronica's office was in a converted house with a waiting room that had soft chairs and magazines nobody read. She came out to get me herself, a woman in her 50s with gray streaks in her dark hair. Her handshake was firm, and her office smelled like lavender. I sat on a couch while she took a chair across from me with a notepad. She asked me to tell her what brought me in, and I started talking about my husband dying. Then I stopped and said there was more to it than that. She waited quietly while I tried to figure out how to explain. I told her my husband left me a journal confessing to an affair with my best friend. The words came out flat and simple, but saying them out loud to a stranger made them feel more real somehow. Veronica nodded and asked how I was handling that information. I laughed and said I wasn't handling it at all. She wrote something down and told me that grieving someone you're also angry at is more common than people think. Something about hearing that made my chest feel less tight. I wasn't the only person sitting in this office trying to hold love and hate for the same person at the same time. Veronica asked me questions about the affair and about Nadia and about how I found out. I answered everything as honestly as I could. Then she asked if I'd considered that maybe my husband told me about the affair because he wanted to be honest with me. I felt my jaw tighten. I told her it felt more like he dumped all his guilt on me and then died so he wouldn't have to deal with the mess. She asked what I meant, and I said he got to confess and feel better about himself while I had to carry the weight of knowing. He unburdened himself and left me holding the bag. Veronica wrote more notes and said that was a valid way to see it. She asked if there were other ways to interpret his choice, and I said no. She didn't push, but I could tell she disagreed. Sterling Powell called Tuesday afternoon while I was doing laundry. He said there was another issue with the estate. My stomach dropped because every time he called it was more bad news. He explained that the house deed only had my husband's name on it even though we were married. I asked how that was possible and he said it happens sometimes. He assured me it was fixable but would require extra paperwork, and possibly going through probate court. I asked how long that would take and he said a few months at minimum. I thanked him and hung up feeling exhausted. Another thing my husband hadn't taken care of properly. I pulled out the house paperwork that night to understand what Sterling was talking about. The deed was dated 6 months before our wedding. My husband bought the house before we got married and apparently never updated the paperwork to add my name. At the time, it probably seemed like a minor thing he'd handle later. But later never came, and now I was dealing with courts and lawyers to prove I had a right to my own home. This small oversight felt huge now. He'd kept me off the deed the same way he'd kept me in the dark about Nadia. Not telling me things seemed to be a pattern I was only seeing clearly now that he was gone. Going through his papers to find what Sterling needed, I opened a folder I hadn't noticed before. Inside were letters in my handwriting from when we were engaged. I'd written him love letters that year because he traveled for work, and we wanted to stay connected. He'd kept every single one, organized by date in a manila folder. I sat on the floor reading letters I'd written 15 years ago about how much I loved him and how excited I was to marry him. The evidence of his love for me was right here in this folder. But so was the journal with evidence of his betrayal. I didn't know which truth was more real, or if they could both be true at the same time. At my next session with Veronica, I told her about finding the letters. She asked how that made me feel, and I said confused. She suggested I might be ready to listen to Nadia's voicemails. I immediately said no. She asked why not, and I said because I didn't want to hear Nadia's voice. Veronica said that avoiding the voicemails gave them more power than they deserved. I argued with her for most of the session about why listening was a bad idea. She listened to all my reasons and then asked if I'd be willing to try with her there. I didn't want to, but I also knew she was probably right. I finally agreed, but said I might only listen to one. Veronica handed me my phone and I pulled up Nadia's voicemails with shaking hands. There were 7 total. I hit play on the first one with Veronica sitting quietly across from me. Nadia's voice came through asking me to please call her back. She said she was sorry and wanted to explain. The message was short and her voice sounded normal. I played the second one. This time she was crying a little, saying she knew I was angry but begging me to let her talk to me. The third voicemail was longer, and Nadia was crying, so hard I could barely understand what she was saying. She kept apologizing and saying she never meant to hurt me. Her voice broke on every other word. I stopped the recording and put my phone down. My hands were shaking. Veronica asked how I felt, and I said I didn't know. The voicemails didn't make me want to forgive Nadia, but they did make her pain feel real in a way it hadn't before. When I'd kicked her out of my house, she'd been crying, but I'd been too angry to really see it. Hearing her breakdown on these messages made me realize she was suffering too. Veronica said I was capable of recognizing Nadia's pain without excusing what she did. Those two things could exist together. I nodded but didn't say anything because I wasn't sure I believed her yet. 3 days later, Nadia sent a text message. It said she had some things that belonged to my husband and she wanted to return them to me. She asked if we could meet one more time. I stared at the text for a long time. My first thought was to delete it and block her number. But then I remembered what Veronica said about the voicemails. I brought the text to my next session and showed it to Veronica. She read it and asked what I wanted to do. I said I wanted to ignore it. She asked if meeting with Nadia might give me closure I didn't get from our first fight. I said maybe, but I didn't know if I could handle seeing her again. Veronica said I didn't have to decide right now. I could sit with it for a while and see how I felt. I sat with that text for 2 days before responding. My thumbs hovered over the keyboard at least 20 times. Finally, I typed that I would meet her at the park by the lake where we used to walk on Sunday mornings back when everything was normal. She responded within minutes saying she'd be there. The park looked exactly the same but felt completely different. I got there early and sat on our usual bench facing the water. When Nadia appeared on the path, I barely recognized her. She'd lost weight and her face looked hollow like she hadn't been sleeping. Dark circles under her eyes. Hair pulled back in a messy ponytail instead of her usual careful styling. Part of me felt satisfied seeing her look so terrible, and then immediately felt disgusted with myself for that reaction. She sat down on the far end of the bench, leaving space between us. Neither of us said anything for a minute. She kept twisting her hands together in her lap. She pulled a small wooden box from her bag and set it on the bench between us. Her hands were shaking. She said these were letters my husband wrote her during the affair. She never threw them away even though she knew she should have. She said I deserved to read them if I wanted the full picture. Then she started crying and apologizing again, using almost the exact same words from our first confrontation. I picked up the box but didn't open it. The wood felt smooth and warm from being in her bag. I told her I didn't know if I'd ever forgive her, but I was trying to understand how we all ended up here. How 20 years of friendship led to this bench with this box between us. She nodded and wiped her face with her sleeve. She said she didn't forgive herself either. That was the first thing she'd said that felt completely honest instead of rehearsed. Not some practiced apology or explanation, but just raw truth about where she was. Nadia started talking without me asking. She said she ended the affair because she realized she was destroying something precious. That our friendship meant more to her than the relationship with him. That watching me trust her while lying every day was killing her from the inside. I turned to look at her directly for the first time. I said she destroyed the friendship anyway by lying for years after it ended. By sitting next to me at dinner parties. By coming to his funeral and holding my hand while we both cried over a man she'd betrayed me with. The affair was bad enough, but the years of pretending made it so much worse. She flinched like I'd hit her, but didn't argue. We sat in silence for a while, watching ducks move across the water. The park was mostly empty on a weekday afternoon. An older man threw bread to the ducks, even though the sign said not to. Nadia finally asked if there was any possibility of us eventually finding our way back to some kind of relationship. Maybe not friendship like before, but something. Anything. I thought about lying to make her feel better, but decided I owed us both honesty. I said I didn't know. That right now I could barely handle my own grief without adding hers to it. That maybe someday, but not now, and maybe not ever. She nodded and stood up. She said she understood and didn't expect anything different. She touched my shoulder briefly before walking back down the path toward the parking lot. I watched her go and felt both relief and loss at the same time. I sat with the box for an hour after she left. The park got busier as afternoon turned to evening. Families with kids, couples walking dogs, normal people living normal lives while I held letters that proved my marriage wasn't what I thought it was. Finally, I opened it. 12 letters on regular notebook paper folded carefully, his handwriting on each one. They were dated spanning the 2 years of the affair. I read them right there on the bench as the sun started setting over the lake. The letters talked about loving both of us in different ways. How being with Nadia felt exciting and new, but being with me felt like home. How he hated himself for not being able to choose. How every time he decided to end it, he'd see Nadia, and all his resolve would disappear. But then he'd come home to me and feel grateful and guilty in equal measure. One letter described a night when Nadia told him she loved him, and he couldn't say it back because saying it would make it too real. Another talked about a close call when I almost found a hotel receipt. Several were just him going in circles about what he should do and never actually doing anything. Reading them felt like watching my marriage from an angle I never knew existed. Like one of those optical illusions where you see either a vase or two faces depending on how you look. Both things were true at the same time, even though they seemed impossible together. The letters didn't excuse anything. They didn't make what he did okay or erase the betrayal. But they did make him more human and less like the villain I'd been building in my mind. He wasn't some calculating cheater who planned everything. He was just a person who made terrible choices and then couldn't figure out how to fix them. I brought the letters to my next session with Veronica 3 days later. She read through them while I sat on her couch picking at a loose thread on the cushion. When she finished, she set them down carefully on her desk. She pointed out patterns in his writing. How he kept using words about being trapped and stuck. How he talked about compartments in his life like he could keep everything separate if he just organized it right. She said it suggested someone trying to manage impossible situations through mental separation, rather than someone who planned to deceive me from the start. I asked if that made it better, and she said no, but it might make it different from what I'd been thinking. Understanding his mindset didn't excuse his actions, but it did make them more understandable as human failure, rather than calculated cruelty. Veronica asked what I wanted my life to look like 6 months from now. The question caught me off guard because I realized I hadn't thought beyond just surviving each day. Getting out of bed, eating something, not crying in public. Those were my only goals. She said maybe it was time to start thinking about practical steps toward rebuilding instead of just processing grief. Not big things, but small concrete actions that moved me forward. We spent the rest of the session talking about what that might look like. Going back to work part-time. Cleaning out more of his things from the house. Maybe reaching out to friends I'd been avoiding. Building a life that acknowledged what happened but didn't let it be the only thing that defined me. Before I left, Veronica mentioned a support group for widows that met Tuesday evenings. She said the facilitator was someone named Layla Hassan, who was really good at holding space for complicated grief. Not the kind of group that pushed forgiveness or moving on, but one that just let people be wherever they were. I took the information even though I wasn't sure I wanted to sit in a room full of other sad people. But Veronica said sometimes hearing other stories made your own feel less isolating. That grief could be lonely, but it didn't have to be solitary. The following Tuesday, I drove to the community center where the group met. I sat in my car for 10 minutes debating whether to go in. Finally, I walked inside and found the right room. 8 women sitting in a circle with one empty chair. Layla introduced herself and welcomed me. She had kind eyes and didn't make a big deal about me being new. The meeting was uncomfortable at first. Going around the circle sharing how long we'd been widowed and how our husbands died felt mechanical. But then women started telling their actual stories and something shifted. One woman's husband died in a car accident on his way to pick up their daughter from soccer practice. Another woman's husband had a heart attack at 42 with no warning. A third woman's husband committed suicide and she was still trying to understand why. Each story was different, but the grief underneath felt familiar. The way they talked about missing small things, how their person's voice sounded, the way they laughed. Inside jokes nobody else understood. The strange guilt of having good days, the anger at being left behind. Nobody tried to fix anyone else or offer solutions. They just listened and nodded and sometimes cried together. When it was my turn, I said my husband died of cancer 6 weeks ago and we were married 14 years. I didn't mention the journal or the affair, just the basic facts of loss. Layla didn't push for more. She thanked me for coming and said grief didn't follow rules or timelines, that everyone's path looked different, and that was okay. Driving home, I felt slightly less alone than I had that morning. Not happy or healed, but maybe just a tiny bit less isolated in what I was carrying. I went back to the support group the next Tuesday. The same 8 women sat in the circle with their various forms of grief that didn't fit into neat boxes. Layla started the meeting the same way, asking if anyone wanted to share. A woman named Jazz raised her hand and talked about discovering her husband had a second family in another state. He'd been living 2 complete lives for 12 years. She found out when the other wife showed up at the funeral. Jazz talked about it without crying, explaining how she verified everything through bank statements and property records. She said the worst part wasn't the betrayal, but realizing she'd been half a person's life without knowing it. I watched her face while she talked and saw something I hadn't seen in my own mirror yet. She looked tired but not broken. She could say the words without falling apart. The other women nodded and asked questions, and nobody tried to tell her it would get better or that she should forgive him. They just listened while she worked through it out loud. After the meeting ended, I caught up with Jazz in the parking lot and asked how long it had been since she found out. She said 3 years. I asked if it still hurt this much, and she said yes, but differently now. The sharp edges had worn down enough that she could hold it without bleeding everywhere. That image stayed with me on the drive home. Gracelyn knocked on my door Thursday morning with coffee and a determined look on her face. She walked past me into the house and said we were cleaning out the closet today. I started to protest, but she was already heading upstairs. She opened his closet door and pulled out the donation boxes I'd been avoiding for weeks. She handed me a garbage bag and told me to keep anything I wanted, but the rest needed to go. We worked in silence for the first hour, folding shirts and pants into boxes. I kept stopping to smell things or hold them against my chest. Gracelyn didn't rush me. When I pulled out his favorite flannel shirt, she took it from my hands and put it in the keep pile without asking. We packed 6 boxes for donation, and I kept 3 shirts that still carried traces of his cologne. The closet looked empty when we finished, but also lighter somehow. Gracelyn helped me carry the boxes to her car and said she'd drop them off tomorrow. Before she left, she hugged me and said the closet wasn't a shrine anymore, just a space I could decide what to do with. I stood in the doorway after she drove away and realized she was right. Sterling called the following week to say the house deed transfer was finalized. All the probate issues had been resolved and the property was legally mine now. He walked me through the paperwork over the phone and said everything was in order. Having legal clarity about the house made something settle in my chest that had been floating loose since my husband died. The house was mine. Not ours, just mine. I could stay or sell or burn it down if I wanted. The choice belonged to me alone. Sterling mentioned the mystery savings account again and asked if I'd decided what to do with the money. I told him I had some ideas. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table with the bank statements spread out in front of me. $18,000 that my husband had saved during the affair. Money that might have been for leaving me, or might have been guilt savings, or might have been nothing meaningful at all. I decided it didn't matter what he intended. The money was mine now, and I could use it however I wanted. I called a handyman the next morning and scheduled repairs for everything my husband had always meant to fix. The garbage disposal that had been broken for months got replaced first. Then I hired a painter to redo the bedroom in a color I picked myself without considering what he would have liked. Watching strangers fix things in my house felt like reclaiming space that had been frozen in time. The bedroom looked completely different when the painter finished. The walls were a soft gray instead of the beige we'd chosen together. I bought new curtains and moved the furniture around. It didn't erase him, but it made the room feel less like a museum of our marriage. I slept better that first night in the repainted bedroom than I had in months. Andres called in early December and asked if I wanted to have dinner with some of my husband's former coworkers. They wanted to share memories and stories about working with him. My first instinct was to say no, because sitting around talking about him with people who didn't know about the affair felt dishonest. But I said yes anyway because I needed to hear about the parts of his life that existed outside of me and Nadia. We met at a casual restaurant downtown. 4 men and 2 women who had worked with my husband for years. They told stories about projects they'd worked on together and inside jokes from the office. Andres talked about my husband staying late to help him finish a presentation when his kid was sick. Someone else mentioned how my husband always brought donuts on Fridays. They painted a picture of a person who was generous and funny and good at his job. Hearing them talk reminded me that he was more than just my husband or Nadia's affair partner. He was a whole person with a work life and friendships and routines I never saw. One of the coworkers, a woman named Janet, mentioned something that made me stop eating. She said my husband had been planning a surprise vacation for our 15th anniversary before he got sick. He'd asked her advice about beach resorts versus mountain cabins. This small piece of information about his intentions toward our future landed differently than everything else. He was thinking ahead. He was planning something nice for us. It didn't erase the affair or make the betrayal hurt less, but it added weight to the other side of the scale. The side that said he loved me and wanted to stay married to me. I thanked Janet for telling me and finished my dinner while the conversation moved on to other topics. Veronica had suggested I start writing my own journal to process my thoughts. She said it might help separate his narrative from mine. I bought a plain notebook and started writing the week after the coworker dinner. Not letters to my husband, but just thoughts as they came. I wrote about being angry and sad and confused all at once. I wrote about missing him and hating him in the same sentence. I wrote about Nadia and whether I'd ever be able to forgive her. The journal became a place to put feelings that didn't have anywhere else to go. Reading back over the entries after a few weeks, I noticed something. My handwriting looked different from his. The words were mine alone. Veronica was right about it creating distance. His journal told his story, but this one told mine. 3 months after our meeting in the park, Nadia sent a text on what would have been my husband's birthday. The message was short. She said she was thinking of me today and hoped I was okay. I stared at my phone for 10 minutes trying to decide whether to respond. Finally, I typed back a simple thank you. It wasn't forgiveness or friendship, but it was acknowledgement that we'd both lost someone we loved. That felt like progress even if we weren't ready for more than that. I didn't expect her to respond, and she didn't. The brief exchange sat between us like a small bridge neither of us was ready to cross yet. I went back to support group the following Tuesday and decided to talk about the affair for the first time. Layla asked if anyone wanted to share, and I raised my hand before I could change my mind. I told them about the journal and Nadia and the 2 years of lies I'd been living with. Several women nodded while I talked. When I finished, 3 other women shared similar stories of finding out things about their husbands after they died. Secret debts, hidden addictions, other women. One woman's husband had a gambling problem she never knew about until the bills came. Another woman found love letters from a coworker in her husband's email. Layla said something that stuck with me. She said carrying contradictory truths about someone we loved was part of complicated grief, not a failure to process things properly. The fact that I loved my husband and felt betrayed by him at the same time didn't mean I was doing grief wrong. It meant I was dealing with a complicated situation that didn't have easy answers. The other women agreed and shared their own contradictions. The meeting ended and I drove home feeling less alone in the mess of feelings I'd been carrying. Somewhere in the middle of January, I realized I was having more good days than bad days. I could think about my husband without immediately falling into anger or despair. The love and betrayal existed together now instead of fighting for space. Some days I missed him so much I couldn't breathe. Other days I was furious about the affair and everything he kept from me. Most days I felt both things at once and had learned to just let them sit there without trying to resolve them. I still reached for him in bed sometimes. I still expected to hear his voice when I walked through the door. But I also painted the bedroom and fixed the garbage disposal and went to dinner with his coworkers. I was building a life that included his memory without being controlled by it. The journal still sat in his desk drawer where I'd found it. I didn't read it anymore, but I didn't throw it away either. It kept living there because I couldn't decide what else to do with it. Veronica brought up forgiveness in our next session, asking what that might look like for me moving forward. I told her I wasn't interested in some big moment where I forgave my husband or Nadia, and everything felt better. She nodded and asked what I was interested in instead. I said I was learning to accept that people are complicated and relationships are messy, and that's just how things are. My husband loved me and betrayed me, and both things were true at the same time. Nadia was my best friend and slept with my husband, and both things existed together. Veronica said that was actually a more realistic form of forgiveness than most people achieved, just letting contradictions exist without needing to resolve them into something neat. I hadn't thought of it as forgiveness, but maybe that's what it was. A few days later, I drove to the cemetery for the first time since the funeral. I sat on the grass next to his headstone and talked out loud about everything I was feeling. I told him I was angry and sad and confused and that I still missed him even though I hated what he did. I told him about reading his letters to Nadia and meeting with her in the park and starting therapy with Veronica. I told him the journal didn't give me closure like he probably hoped it would, just more questions I'd never get answers to. None of it resolved anything, but saying the words out loud to where he was buried felt important somehow. I sat there for almost an hour before I left. Orly texted me the following week saying Nadia was doing better in therapy and had started dating someone new. She said Nadia wanted me to know she was moving forward and hoped I was too. I read the message 3 times waiting for the hurt to hit, but it didn't come the way I expected. Instead, I felt genuinely glad she was moving forward even if we weren't doing it together. I texted Orly back saying I was happy for her sister and left it at that. 5 months had passed since I read the journal, and I was functioning in my daily life while carrying the weight of what I knew about my marriage. I went to work and saw Veronica weekly and attended support group on Tuesdays. I had dinner with Gracelyn sometimes and met Andres for coffee when he reached out. The grief hadn't disappeared, and the betrayal still stung when I thought about it too long. But I was learning to build a life that held space for both the love I had and the lies I lived with. Some days were harder than others, and I still reached for my husband in bed sometimes. But I was here and functioning, and that felt like enough for now.